Hiya folks, thanks for tuning in. The focus of this short paper will be on motion in animation. For a little bit of context, this paper is in preparation for a book I'm writing, which essentially aims to do for animation what David Bordwell, Kristen Thompson, and Jeff Smith's Film Art and Introduction does for live action film. With that in mind, I'm not making a narrowly defined argument as such, but rather I'm going to outline certain expressive principles of animation which will help readers experience the medium with a newly sensitized eye. While there is a shared language between live-action film and animation, one of the key differences between the two mediums is the fact that the impression of motion is artificially created rather than mechanically captured in animation. As a consequence, certain expressive variables come into play which warrant consideration. With that in mind, let me begin by explaining the difference between full and limited animation. If you're not familiar with this distinction, full animation is the more expensive of the two, requiring a new drawn image for every frame. Limited animation is an industry practice that has primarily flourished on television. It essentially refers to a range of cost-cutting measures which animators can apply to fit within lower budgets. Instead of the more lavish animation you would see in Disney movies, studios like Hanna-Barbera would apply a series of techniques which allowed animators to produce more material in less time with smaller crews. These techniques included cycles, where animated characters would move back and forth in the same string of images instead of having a new drawing for every single frame. That's what you can see in this Charlie Brown clip. Some of these are less than 2 seconds of animation, looped back and forth and stretched to over 30 seconds. Sectioning is another limited animation technique where only the essential part of the character moves. This is often the mouth. There is also camera movement, where nothing is animated, rather on-screen movement is created by zooming in and out of images. Pull cells is another technique where single images are pulled across the background to create motion. Stop images can also be applied, where movement simply stops for a little while. The sound is typically used to carry the image along at this point, so it doesn't look like the film has come to a complete halt. They are often used for exterior shots. Finally, and most important to this discussion, is the use of animation on 3s and 4s. 1s and 2s are considered full animation, 3s and 4s are limited animation. In a sequence animated on 1s, the artist draws an image that lasts for a single frame, usually that's 24 per second, before being replaced with another one. This is the most expensive to produce, but it creates notably smooth motion. If an animated sequence appears on 2s, this means each drawing lasts for 2 frames each, so you will see 12 separate images per second. Generally, it's quite difficult to discern the difference between animation on 1s and 2s, although those with a specialist eye will know that animating on 2s gives slightly snappier movements. Since animation is such a laborious process, any economy is going to be a big one. So cutting your number of images in half by animating on 2s will save a lot of labour. However, animating on 2s still requires a great deal of work during production. This is where animating on 3s and 4s comes in. As you will guess, this means that every animated image will last for either 3 or 4 frames each, respectively. Again, this saves the studio a considerable amount of money, which might either be saved or invested in other aspects of production, such as the detail of the animated characters. On 3s and 4s, the less fluid motion is clearly visible, yet despite the fact this somewhat jittery movement would be considered distracting and irritating in live action, audiences are proven to be notably adaptable and tolerant of animation on 3s and 4s as long as it is done artfully. So here you can see Aladdin, which would have been done on 1s and sometimes 2s, and then Pokemon is more likely to be on 3s and 4s. Japanese animation, or anime, is particularly notable for making all the techniques of limited animation part of a cohesive and intentional style, rather than simply animation being done this way to save money, which is what cartoons from studios such as Hanna-Barbera or Filmation look like to animators today. Beyond animation on 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s, there is also a newly developed software called Dane, which is an algorithm software designed to increase the smoothness of hand-drawn animation. As you can see in this video, it does an impressive job of turning animation done at 24 frames per second into animation on 1s at 60 frames per second. This stands to make major changes in the way industrial 2D animation is produced. With this said, we need not assume that the best possible animation is always going to be the smoothest. It will depend on what aesthetic effect the filmmaker wants to create. The bite of a slower frame rate, when well used, is a powerful expressive tool at the animator's disposal. Traditionally speaking, there is no clear equivalent in live-action film to animating on 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. Frame rates have changed from silent to sound film, 16 frames per second to 24 respectively. Television and video, which has been 25, 30, and 60 frames per second, along with other variations. But generally, films and TV shows don't choose frame rates as an aesthetic choice. Frame rates are selected according to industrial convention. One recent exception to this would be Peter Jackson's decision to film The Hobbit at 48 frames per second as an aesthetic choice, in part as a solution to eye strain when viewing the film in 3D. The higher frame rate was received at the time with mixed reactions from audiences, some of whom claimed it looked too lifelike, thus breaking the suspension of disbelief. Audiences are also more accustomed to seeing higher frame rates on television. Perhaps paradoxically, audiences unconsciously associate high-quality productions at a slower frame rate, so 24 frames per second, and lower-quality productions at a higher frame rate. While cinematic motion at 24 frames per second always seemed the same as real life to general audiences, it only turns out to be running at a perceptually acceptable speed. But when compared with faster frame rates, the distinction is readily discernible. According to psychologist Jeffrey Sachs, video produced at 240 frames per second would approximate real-life motion as we see it in day-to-day life. What this tells us is that audiences are surprisingly adaptable at viewing different frame rates. It all looks like motion to us as soon as it reaches a certain speed, and the difference is more felt than consciously seen when frame rates vary. Animation takes this even further. Even when we can consciously see that it isn't smooth motion on 3s and 4s, audiences have still found it tolerable. For the next part of this presentation, I would like to give consideration to the interconnected issue of motion blur in animation. If you're going to make things move cinematically, then they need to blur cinematically as well. Motion blur began, of course, with the invention of photography. In this medium, images were not being captured in the smallest possible units of time. Rather, short passages of time were being captured and printed out. This led to motion blur, which would go on to inspire Giacomo Balla to produce his iconic painting, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. With photography's invention, canvas painting shifted from photographic realism being the ultimate goal to other expressive possibilities. This would also go on to influence other visual arts such as comic books and animation. As stated at the beginning of this presentation, movement is constructed in animation rather than mechanically captured. As such, motion blur does not come for free. To illustrate this point, consider this scene from Jason and the Argonauts in 1963, in which live-action men do battle with stop-motion skeletons, animated by Ray Harryhausen. If we freeze-frame this moment here, you will see that the man is in the middle of a motion blur, while the skeleton is very clear, even though they're both moving at roughly the same speed. This moment serves to remind us that motion blur has to be added artificially in animation, and technology had not yet been developed to reckon with this question when the film was made in the early 1960s. In live action, motion blur occurs depending on the rate of the shutter speed. In stills photography, an average consumer camera takes pictures at about 1/60th of a second. With more specialist DSLRs or mirrorless cameras, we have the option of taking photographs with an exposure of as little time as 4,000th of a second, or sometimes even faster. Or an exposure can be as long as several minutes. If you want a sharp image of a fast-moving object, like this dolphin leaping in the air, it should be photographed at around 1600th of a second or faster. If your shutter speed is too slow, you will have undesirable blur in your picture, particularly if the camera is handheld. On some occasions, motion blur is desirable, such as in this image of a waterfall which was taken on a tripod with a 5-second shutter speed. Or light streaks from cars moving through a cityscape. This image took a 30-second exposure. In film and video ranging from 24 to 30 frames per second, the camera normally produces images at a shutter speed of 1/50th or 1/60th of a second. Anything slower would be difficult to manage since it would produce excess motion blur. The shutter speed then determines the threshold at which motion blur begins to occur. Here we can see 3 consecutive frames of the Black Panther entering a fight. The first frame, as you can see, is very clear, while the next 2 blur as he moves forward to join the fight. If the shutter speed was at, say, 1,000th of a second instead of 1/60th, there would not have been any blur. Animators, in turn, needed to find a way to approximate motion blur in their own medium. For objects to move in the way we were accustomed to in the movies, motion blur needed to be artificially added. With hand-drawn animation, the question was creatively addressed with the application of 3 techniques. They were known as swipes, smears, and multiples. Swipes are used in a quick transition from one movement to the next, and it is used as trailing speed lines. A smear animation gets its name because it looks like a hand smeared a page with 2 images drawn on it. As well as simulating motion blur, it also saves animation time by limiting the amount of in-between drawings on an action. It is used when something jumps very quickly from one position to the next. Multiples are overlapping or repeated shapes. Often these are used in conjunction with smears. These are very fun to freeze frame. All 3 techniques, swipes, smears, and multiples, have proven to be successful alternatives to photographic motion blur in 2D animation. As a brief aside, stop-motion animators eventually came up with solutions as to how to add motion blur artificially through digital means. In addition, CG animators have found ways to closely approximate live-action blur as well. It appears that more stylized approaches to motion blur are best suited to 2D animation rather than stop-motion or CG. To wrap up then, this short paper has reviewed some of the key issues at play when working with animated motion. Full and limited animation, animating on 1s, 2s, 3s and 4s, and motion blur by way of swipes, smears and multiples. All of these issues determine key distinctions between live action and animated motion. I hope you found the paper engaging. I'm aware that it hasn't drawn directly from the field of perceptual psychology in much detail, and I expect there may be considerable scope in doing so. With that in mind, any questions or comments will be gratefully received. Many thanks indeed for listening. That's all, folks.